Sarah Martinez stepped off the commercial flight at Peterson Air Force Base, her civilian clothes drawing curious glances from the uniformed personnel bustling through the terminal. The lightweight blazer and slacks she wore concealed the decades of military service etched into her posture and the sharp awareness in her dark eyes. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had commanded naval vessels through treacherous waters and led thousands of sailors through complex operations across 3 different oceans. The temporary assignment to the joint military base had come through official channels, but due to security protocols surrounding her current intelligence work, her true rank remained classified. The paperwork identified her simply as S. Martinez, Naval Consultant, a deliberately vague designation that would allow her to conduct her assessment of the base's cybersecurity infrastructure without drawing unwanted attention. Colonel James Harrison spotted her immediately as she collected her single piece of luggage. His steel-gray eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, a middle-aged woman in business attire who clearly didn't belong among the crisp uniforms and military precision that defined his domain. Harrison had commanded this section of the base for 3 years, and he prided himself on maintaining the highest standards of military discipline and protocol. "You must be the consultant," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had become second nature after 25 years of military service. He didn't offer to help with her luggage or extend the courtesy of a proper introduction. "I'm Colonel Harrison. I run things around here." Sarah recognized the type immediately. Career military officer, probably worked his way up through the ranks, territorial about his command, and clearly uncomfortable with civilians on his base. She had encountered hundreds of officers like Harrison throughout her career, and experience had taught her that sometimes the best approach was to let assumptions play out naturally. "Thank you for the welcome, Colonel," she replied evenly, adjusting the strap of her laptop bag. "I'm looking forward to working here." Harrison's expression suggested he was anything but pleased about the arrangement. "Let me be clear about something right away. This is a military installation with military standards. I don't know what kind of loose civilian workplace you're used to, but here we follow proper protocol and chain of command. You'll report your activities to me daily, and you'll stay out of areas where you don't belong." Sarah nodded politely, though inwardly she noted the irony. As a Rear Admiral, she technically outranked Harrison by 2 full grades, but her cover required maintaining the fiction of being a civilian contractor. The assignment was too important to jeopardize over matters of military courtesy. The drive to the base's administrative complex gave Harrison an opportunity to establish what he clearly viewed as the proper dynamic between them. "I've read your file. What little there was of it," he said, navigating the vehicle through the maze of military buildings. "Says you have some computer background. Well, let me tell you something about military cybersecurity. It's not like the private sector where you can just wing it and hope for the best. Lives depend on our systems working perfectly." Sarah watched the familiar sights of military life pass by: young airmen in formation, maintenance crews working on aircraft, the controlled chaos that characterized any active military installation. "I understand the importance of reliable systems, Colonel," she said simply. "Do you?" Harrison's laugh was short and skeptical. "Have you ever been responsible for operations where a system failure could cost lives? Have you ever had to make split-second decisions while under enemy fire?" The questions hung in the air. Sarah could have told him about the night her destroyer had been targeted by anti-ship missiles in the Persian Gulf, or about the countless hours she had spent coordinating naval operations while navigating both technical failures and hostile environments. Instead, she simply said, "I'll do my best to learn from the military perspective during my time here." Harrison seemed satisfied with what he interpreted as appropriate deference. "That's the right attitude. Stick to that, and we'll get along fine." The temporary office assigned to Sarah was sparse but functional: a desk, computer terminal, and filing cabinets in a small room adjacent to the main cybersecurity operations center. Colonel Harrison made a point of personally escorting her to the space, using the opportunity to lay out his expectations. "Your access is limited to Level 2 systems only," he explained, producing a temporary identification badge. "Any requests for additional access go through me personally. You'll work standard business hours, ERO 800 to 1700, and your movements on base will be logged and monitored." Sarah accepted the badge, noting its limitations. Her actual security clearance was several levels higher than what Harrison was offering, but requesting appropriate access would require revealing information that could compromise her mission. "I've also assigned Lieutenant Morrison to be your escort," Harrison continued. "He'll make sure you don't wander into restricted areas or access systems beyond your authorization level." Lieutenant Morrison turned out to be an earnest young officer fresh from the Air Force Academy, clearly uncomfortable with what he perceived as babysitting duty. His discomfort was evident as he showed Sarah to her workspace and explained the basic computer protocols. "Ma'am, I have to ask you to stay within this section of the building," Morrison said, consulting a printed list. "Colonel Harrison was very specific about the boundaries of your work area." Sarah settled into her temporary office and began the careful process of assessing the base's cybersecurity infrastructure while maintaining her cover. The systems she could access revealed immediate vulnerabilities, outdated software, weak password protocols, and communication channels that would be easily compromised by any sophisticated adversary. Over the following days, Colonel Harrison made regular appearances in her office, ostensibly to check on her progress, but clearly to reinforce his authority over the situation. His comments grew increasingly condescending as he became more comfortable with what he viewed as his obvious superiority over the civilian consultant. "Find anything interesting in our computer systems?" he would ask, the question loaded with skepticism about her capabilities. "There are some areas that could use attention," Sarah would reply diplomatically. "Such as?" Harrison's tone suggested he doubted she could identify anything his own technical staff hadn't already addressed. Sarah found herself in the difficult position of trying to communicate serious security concerns while limited by both her restricted access and the need to maintain her cover. When she mentioned basic vulnerabilities in password management, Harrison dismissed her observations as civilian overcautiousness. "This is a military base, not some corporation worried about hackers stealing customer data," he said dismissively. "Our people know how to handle security." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. As someone who had spent years coordinating cybersecurity for entire naval fleets, she recognized threats that could compromise not just base operations, but potentially national security interests. Yet Harrison's preconceptions about civilian contractors made him unwilling to seriously consider her assessments. The pattern continued throughout her first week on base. Harrison would appear in her office without warning, making comments that grew increasingly inappropriate as he became more confident in his perceived position of authority over her. "You know, Martinez, in the military we believe in earning respect through service and sacrifice," he said during one unexpected visit. "It's not like the civilian world where you can just talk your way into a position." Sarah continued typing her security assessment, keeping her expression neutral. "I understand the military values service, Colonel." "Do you really?" Harrison settled into the chair across from her desk without invitation. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you're getting paid to play around with computers while real military personnel handle the serious work of defending this country." The comment stung more than Sarah cared to admit. Her own military service had begun before Harrison was even commissioned, and she had commanded operations that dwarfed anything he had likely encountered in his career. Yet the requirements of her mission meant accepting his misconceptions without correction. As the days passed, Harrison's behavior became increasingly problematic. He seemed to view her presence as an opportunity to demonstrate his military superiority over what he perceived as an inexperienced civilian. His comments during their daily check-ins grew more personal and less professional. "I have to wonder what kind of connections you must have had to get this assignment," he said one afternoon, leaning against her office doorframe. "Usually we only see consultants with actual military backgrounds for sensitive work like this." Sarah looked up from her computer screen, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm sure the proper authorities considered my qualifications before making the assignment, Colonel." Harrison's laugh was dismissive. "Proper authorities? Right. Well, I suppose even desk jobs require some kind of oversight these days." The assumption that she was somehow unqualified or had obtained her position through favoritism was particularly galling given Sarah's actual background. She had earned every promotion through demonstrated competence under pressure, often in situations where Harrison's peacetime experience would have been inadequate preparation. Lieutenant Morrison, who had grown comfortable with Sarah during their daily interactions, began to look uncomfortable during Harrison's visits. The young officer was clearly caught between his respect for rank and his growing recognition that the colonel's behavior toward their visitor was becoming inappropriate. "Ma'am," Morrison said after one particularly awkward encounter, "is there anything you need me to discuss with my superiors about your working conditions here?" Sarah appreciated the young man's concern, but any complaint would require explanations that could compromise her mission. "I'm fine, Lieutenant. Colonel Harrison is just ensuring that security protocols are properly followed." As her second week on the base began, Sarah had completed enough of her assessment to identify several critical vulnerabilities that required immediate attention. The challenge was communicating these concerns to appropriate authorities while working around Harrison's dismissive attitude and without revealing information that would expose her true identity and purpose. The morning briefing on Monday brought new complications. Harrison had scheduled what he called a progress review with several members of his staff present, clearly intending to demonstrate his authority over the civilian consultant in front of his subordinates. "So, Martinez," he began, settling into his chair at the head of the small conference table, "enlighten us about what our computer systems need that my trained military cybersecurity specialists somehow missed." The question was loaded with skepticism and designed to put Sarah on the defensive in front of the assembled officers. She recognized the dynamics at play. Harrison was using the meeting to reinforce his position while simultaneously undermining her credibility with his staff. Sarah opened her preliminary report, knowing that her carefully documented findings would speak for themselves despite Harrison's dismissive attitude. What she had discovered in the base's cybersecurity infrastructure was far more serious than simple password protocols or outdated software. The vulnerabilities she had identified could potentially compromise classified communications and operational security for multiple military commands. The challenge was presenting these findings in a way that would be taken seriously by officers who had been conditioned to view her as an unqualified civilian consultant rather than someone with extensive experience in military cybersecurity operations. The morning briefing room felt tense as Sarah opened her laptop and prepared to present her findings. Colonel Harrison sat at the head of the table with his arms crossed, flanked by Major Patricia Wells from Communications, Captain Rodriguez from IT Security, and Lieutenant Morrison, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Before we begin," Harrison announced to his staff, "I want everyone to understand that this is primarily an educational exercise. Ms. Martinez here is going to tell us about computer security from a civilian perspective, which might give us some insights into how non-military personnel view our systems." Sarah recognized the setup immediately. Harrison was framing her presentation as amateur observations rather than professional assessment, ensuring that anything she said would be viewed through the lens of civilian inexperience rather than legitimate security concerns. "Thank you for the opportunity to share my observations," Sarah began, connecting her laptop to the room's display system. "During my review of accessible systems, I've identified several areas where security protocols could be strengthened. Her first slide showed a basic network diagram highlighting communication pathways between different base systems. The presentation was carefully designed to communicate serious concerns while working within her restricted access levels and maintaining her civilian cover. Your primary communication network has several vulnerability points, Sarah explained, using a laser pointer to highlight specific connections. An adversary with basic penetration capabilities could potentially access classified communications through these pathways. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward, his technical background making him immediately interested in the specifics. "Can you show us exactly what you found?" Before Sarah could respond, Harrison interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Rodriguez, let's not get bogged down in technical details that probably aren't applicable to our actual security posture. Ms. Martinez has had limited access to our systems, so she's only seeing a small piece of the overall picture." Sarah felt frustration building as Harrison systematically undermined her presentation before she could even explain the scope of what she had discovered. The vulnerabilities she had identified were serious enough to warrant immediate attention from base security personnel, yet Harrison's preconceptions were preventing any meaningful discussion of the actual threats. "Colonel, if I may," Sarah said carefully, "the communication pathways I'm highlighting don't require extensive access to identify. These are structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited regardless of classification levels." Harrison's expression hardened. "Martinez, I think you're forgetting your place here. This is a military installation with security measures that have been developed and tested by people with actual military experience. Your civilian perspective might be interesting, but it's not going to revolutionize how we handle security." Major Wells, who had remained silent until this point, spoke up with obvious discomfort. "Sir, maybe we should at least review what she's found before dismissing it entirely." "Major," Harrison's voice carried clear warning, "I appreciate your thoroughness, but we need to maintain perspective here. Ms. Martinez is a contractor with limited access and no military background. She's not in a position to identify vulnerabilities that trained military cybersecurity specialists would miss." The assumption that she lacked military background was becoming increasingly difficult for Sarah to tolerate. Her actual experience included cybersecurity operations for naval fleets, coordination with multiple military intelligence agencies, and responsibility for communication security in active combat zones. Yet Harrison's misconceptions made him unable to consider that her observations might have merit. Sarah continued her presentation despite the hostile environment, documenting password vulnerabilities, outdated encryption protocols, and communication channels that could be easily compromised by sophisticated adversaries. Each point she raised was met with skepticism or outright dismissal from Harrison. "These password protocols you're concerned about," Harrison said after reviewing one of her slides, "are standard military procedures that have been in place for years. Just because they don't match whatever civilian standards you're used to doesn't mean they're inadequate." "Actually, Colonel," Captain Rodriguez interjected, "some of these issues she's identifying are legitimate concerns. We've been discussing similar vulnerabilities in our technical meetings." Harrison turned his attention to Rodriguez with obvious displeasure. "Captain, are you suggesting that a civilian contractor with limited access has identified security issues that you and your team failed to address?" The question put Rodriguez in an impossible position. Supporting Sarah's findings meant implicitly criticizing his superior officer's judgment, while dismissing legitimate security concerns could compromise base operations. "Sir, I'm just saying that some of these observations align with concerns we've discussed internally," Rodriguez said carefully. "Well, I'm sure you'll address any actual issues through proper military channels," Harrison replied curtly. "We don't need civilian contractors telling us how to run military cybersecurity." As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself increasingly constrained by the impossible dynamics Harrison had created. Her attempts to communicate serious security threats were being systematically dismissed, not because the threats weren't real, but because Harrison's preconceptions about civilian contractors made him unwilling to consider the possibility that she might have relevant expertise. The situation grew more problematic when Harrison began making personal comments that went well beyond professional disagreement with her assessment. "You know, Martinez," he said during a break in the presentation, "I have to wonder if you've ever actually worked in any kind of high-pressure environment. Military cybersecurity isn't like troubleshooting office computers or setting up home networks." Lieutenant Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recognizing that Harrison's comments were inappropriate regardless of Sarah's background or qualifications. "I understand that military environments have unique requirements," Sarah replied evenly, maintaining her composure despite the increasingly personal nature of Harrison's attacks. "Do you really?" Harrison leaned back in his chair with obvious skepticism. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you're applying civilian standards to military operations without understanding the fundamental differences between the two environments." Sarah's actual experience commanding naval cybersecurity operations during active military campaigns would have provided the perfect response to Harrison's assumptions, but revealing that experience would compromise her mission and potentially expose classified information about her current assignment. Major Wells intervened with obvious discomfort about the direction of the conversation. "Sir, perhaps we should focus on the technical aspects of the presentation rather than questioning Ms. Martinez's general background." Harrison's response made clear that he viewed Wells's suggestion as inappropriate interference with his authority. "Major, I think I'm capable of determining the appropriate focus for briefings in my command." The meeting concluded with Harrison dismissing most of Sarah's findings as irrelevant civilian concerns, while grudgingly acknowledging that Captain Rodriguez could look into a few of the technical issues she had raised. The dismissive attitude effectively neutralized what should have been serious security discussions. As the staff filed out of the conference room, Lieutenant Morrison approached Sarah with obvious concern about what had transpired. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I want to apologize for how that meeting went. Some of the issues you raised seemed like legitimate concerns that deserved more serious consideration." Sarah appreciated the young officer's integrity, but she also recognized that his position made it impossible for him to directly challenge his superior officer's handling of the situation. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I understand the dynamics here are complicated." Over the following days, Harrison's behavior toward Sarah became increasingly problematic as his confidence in his perceived authority over her grew. His daily visits to her office evolved from professional check-ins to what felt more like personal harassment, designed to reinforce his view of the power dynamic between them. "I've been thinking about your presentation the other day," he said during one unexpected visit, settling into the chair across from her desk without invitation. "And I realized that the real problem isn't with our security systems. The problem is with consultants who think they can waltz into a military environment and immediately identify issues that trained military personnel somehow missed." Sarah continued working on her assessment, knowing that engaging with Harrison's comments would only escalate the situation. Her actual findings were becoming more concerning as she gained access to additional system information through her legitimate research activities. "You know what I think?" Harrison continued, clearly interpreting her silence as acknowledgement of his authority. "I think civilian contractors get these military assignments because someone in procurement doesn't understand the difference between real cybersecurity work and the kind of basic computer maintenance that passes for security in the private sector." The irony of Harrison's comments wasn't lost on Sarah. Her current assignment had come directly from naval intelligence leadership specifically because of her unique combination of technical expertise and operational military experience. The mission required someone who could assess military cybersecurity infrastructure while maintaining cover, and her background made her uniquely qualified for exactly that type of work. "I'm just doing my best to fulfill the assignment I was given," Sarah replied diplomatically. Your best, Harrison repeated with obvious skepticism. Well, I suppose that's all anyone can ask for, even when someone's best isn't really adequate for the task at hand. The personal attacks were becoming more frequent and more pointed as Harrison grew comfortable with what he perceived as his complete authority over her situation. His comments often included implications about her competence, her qualifications, and her right to be working on a military installation. Captain Rodriguez began stopping by Sarah's office periodically to discuss technical aspects of her findings, clearly recognizing the legitimacy of her concerns despite Harrison's dismissive attitude. During these conversations, Rodriguez revealed information that made Sarah's actual findings even more alarming. Some of the vulnerabilities you identified, Rodriguez said during one of these visits, connect to systems that handle classified communications for multiple commands. If someone could exploit those pathways, they might be able to access information well beyond this base. Sarah nodded, though she couldn't explain that her actual security clearance and military experience made her fully aware of the implications of compromised military communications networks. "Have you been able to discuss these concerns with Colonel Harrison?" she asked. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. "I've tried, but he seems convinced that your findings aren't relevant to our actual security posture. He keeps saying that civilian contractors don't understand military cybersecurity requirements." The conversation was interrupted by Harrison's unexpected appearance in Sarah's office doorway. His expression immediately hardened when he saw Rodriguez engaged in what appeared to be a serious technical discussion with the civilian consultant. "Captain Rodriguez," Harrison said with obvious displeasure, "I thought I made it clear that any security discussions should be coordinated through me." Rodriguez straightened to attention. "Yes, sir. I was just clarifying some technical details from Ms. Martinez's presentation." "I see," Harrison replied, his tone making clear that he viewed Rodriguez's independent communication with Sarah as inappropriate. "In the future, I'd appreciate being included in any discussions about base security matters." After Rodriguez left, Harrison remained in Sarah's office, using the opportunity to make his expectations even more explicit. "Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you," he said, closing her office door behind him. "I don't appreciate my staff being influenced by civilian perspectives on military operations. Your job here is to provide whatever technical support you can within your limited scope, not to convince my officers that our established security procedures are inadequate." Sarah looked up from her computer, meeting Harrison's gaze directly. "Colonel, I'm simply documenting what I observe in the systems I'm authorized to access." "What you observe?" Harrison repeated with obvious skepticism. "And I suppose your observations just happen to identify problems that my trained military cybersecurity specialists somehow missed." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Harrison was making clear that he viewed any criticism of base security as a personal attack on his competence as commanding officer. "I'm not making any judgments about existing procedures," Sarah replied carefully. "I'm just noting areas where additional security measures might be beneficial." Harrison's laugh was harsh. "Additional security measures. Right. Let me explain something to you about military operations, Martinez. Security isn't just about having the latest technology or following every civilian cybersecurity trend. It's about having people you can trust in positions of responsibility. It's about having procedures that have been tested under real-world conditions by people with actual military experience." The implication was clear. Harrison viewed Sarah as someone who couldn't be trusted with genuine responsibility because of her perceived lack of military background. As her third week on the base began, Sarah found herself in an increasingly difficult position. Her assessment had identified serious vulnerabilities that required immediate attention from appropriate military authorities, yet Harrison's misconceptions and increasingly hostile behavior were preventing any meaningful action on her findings. The situation reached a critical point when Sarah discovered evidence of actual compromise attempts against base communications systems. evidence that suggested sophisticated adversaries were actively attempting to exploit the very vulnerabilities she had identified in her assessment. Sarah stared at her computer screen, her blood running cold as she analyzed the network traffic logs that had just appeared in her routine monitoring. The patterns were unmistakable to someone with her experience. Sophisticated probing attempts that matched the exact vulnerabilities she had identified in her security assessment. Someone was actively attempting to exploit the base's communication systems, using methods that would likely succeed given the current security posture. The discovery put her in an impossible position. The evidence required immediate action from base security personnel, but Harrison's dismissive attitude toward her findings made it unlikely he would take the threat seriously. Worse, explaining how she had detected the intrusion attempts might require revealing capabilities that went beyond her supposed civilian contractor access. Sarah quickly documented the intrusion evidence, knowing that time was critical if the base was going to prevent a successful compromise of its communication systems. The attack pattern suggested adversaries with significant technical sophistication and detailed knowledge of military communication protocols. She picked up her phone to contact Captain Rodriguez, hoping his technical background would help him understand the urgency of the situation. But before she could dial, Colonel Harrison appeared in her doorway for his routine morning harassment session. "Working hard this morning, Martinez?" he asked, with his usual condescending tone. "I hope you're not wasting time trying to find more imaginary problems with our security systems." Sarah looked up from her screen, knowing that what she was about to say would likely trigger another confrontation with Harrison. "Colonel, I need to report some urgent findings. There's evidence of active intrusion attempts against base communication systems." Harrison's expression immediately shifted from casual condescension to obvious skepticism. Intrusion attempts? And how exactly would a civilian contractor with limited system access be in a position to detect military cybersecurity threats? "The evidence is in the network traffic logs," Sarah replied, turning her monitor so Harrison could see the data she had compiled. "These patterns indicate sophisticated probing of the exact vulnerabilities I identified in my security assessment." Harrison glanced dismissively at her screen, without really examining the data. "Martinez, I think you're letting your imagination run away with you. What you're probably seeing is routine network maintenance or authorized testing by my technical staff." "Colonel, these patterns are consistent with hostile reconnaissance," Sarah insisted, her professional training overriding her civilian cover requirements. "Someone is actively mapping our communication pathways for what appears to be a planned intrusion." "Our communication pathways," Harrison repeated with obvious irritation. "Martinez, let me remind you that these aren't our anything. This is a military installation with military communication systems that are managed by military personnel with appropriate training and security clearances." The dismissal was so complete that Sarah realized Harrison wasn't even considering the possibility that her findings might be legitimate. His preconceptions about civilian contractors had made him incapable of recognizing a genuine security threat. "Sir, with respect, this evidence needs immediate evaluation by your cybersecurity team," Sarah pressed, knowing that further argument might compromise her cover, but unable to ignore what appeared to be an active attack against military systems. Harrison's expression hardened as he interpreted her persistence as insubordination. "Martinez, I'm going to say this once more, and I want you to understand it clearly. You are a civilian contractor with limited access to selected systems. You are not qualified to assess military cybersecurity threats, and you are certainly not in a position to tell military personnel how to respond to supposed security issues." Before Sarah could respond, Harrison continued with what amounted to a direct threat to her continued presence on the base. "Furthermore, I'm beginning to question whether this assignment is working out as intended. Your tendency to create problems where none exist and your apparent inability to understand your proper role here are becoming disruptive to base operations." The implicit threat was clear. Harrison was considering terminating her assignment, which would prevent completion of her actual mission and leave the base vulnerable to the active threats she had discovered. Sarah made a difficult decision. The evidence of active intrusion attempts was too serious to ignore, regardless of the consequences for her cover or her mission. Military personnel were potentially at risk, and her oath as a naval officer required placing their safety above her assignment parameters. "Colonel Harrison," she said, standing and facing him directly, "I need you to contact base security immediately and report possible hostile intrusion attempts against your communication systems. The evidence is clear and the threat is immediate." Harrison's face flushed with anger at what he perceived as a civilian contractor giving him direct orders. "That's enough, Martinez. You're clearly unable to understand appropriate boundaries in a military environment. I'm terminating your access to base systems effective immediately." "Sir, you don't understand," Sarah began, knowing she was approaching the point where maintaining her cover might become impossible. "No, you don't understand," Harrison interrupted angrily. "You're a civilian contractor who somehow convinced someone to give you access to military systems you have no business touching. You've spent 3 weeks trying to convince trained military personnel that their security procedures are inadequate, and now you're trying to create some kind of crisis to justify your presence here." The accusation that she was fabricating security threats to justify her assignment was the final straw. Sarah had endured weeks of personal attacks and professional dismissal, but she couldn't allow Harrison's misconceptions to compromise actual military security. At that moment, Captain Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, looking agitated and holding a tablet with network monitoring data. "Sir," Rodriguez said urgently, "we've detected what appears to be coordinated probing attempts against our primary communication channels. The pattern suggests sophisticated adversaries with detailed knowledge of our network architecture." Harrison turned to Rodriguez with obvious irritation at the interruption. "Captain, what are you talking about?" "Sir, someone is actively attempting to penetrate our communication systems," Rodriguez explained, showing Harrison the data on his tablet. The attack vectors match several vulnerabilities that were identified in recent security assessments. Sarah watched Harrison's expression as Rodriguez described exactly what she had been trying to explain for the past 20 minutes. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same information was being taken seriously when presented by a uniformed military officer rather than a civilian contractor. "How long has this been going on?" Harrison demanded. "The probing attempts appear to have started sometime in the last few hours," Rodriguez replied. "But, sir, the vulnerabilities being exploited match exactly what Ms. Martinez documented in her security assessment. She identified these exact pathways as potential intrusion vectors." Harrison looked back and forth between Rodriguez and Sarah, clearly struggling to reconcile his dismissive attitude toward her findings with the evidence of actual security threats targeting the systems she had warned about. "Are you saying that her civilian assessment actually identified legitimate vulnerabilities?" Harrison asked Rodriguez. "Sir, her technical analysis was extremely accurate," Rodriguez replied. "The attack patterns we're seeing now are exploiting precisely the security gaps she documented." Sarah could see the wheels turning in Harrison's mind as he tried to process the implications of what Rodriguez was telling him. The civilian contractor he had been dismissing and harassing for 3 weeks had apparently identified genuine security vulnerabilities that were now being actively exploited by hostile adversaries. "Rodriguez," Harrison said slowly, "coordinate with base security to implement immediate countermeasures and get me a complete briefing on these intrusion attempts within the hour." As Rodriguez hurried away to coordinate the security response, Harrison turned back to Sarah with an expression that mixed confusion, embarrassment, and lingering skepticism. "Martinez," he began, then stopped, apparently unsure how to proceed. Sarah recognized that the moment had arrived when maintaining her civilian cover was no longer possible or appropriate. The active security threat required immediate coordination with appropriate military authorities, and Harrison's misconceptions were preventing effective response to the situation. "Colonel Harrison," she said formally, reaching into her laptop bag and withdrawing a sealed envelope that contained her actual military identification and assignment orders. "I think it's time we clarified some misunderstandings about my background and my presence here." Harrison watched with growing confusion as Sarah opened the envelope and handed him documents that he clearly hadn't expected to see. "These are your actual assignment orders and identification," Sarah explained as Harrison examined the papers with increasing bewilderment. Sarah watched Harrison's face change as he read through the documents that identified her as Rear Admiral Sarah Martinez, United States Navy, currently assigned to naval intelligence operations with top-secret security clearances and cybersecurity specialization. "Admiral," Harrison said weakly, looking up from the papers with an expression of complete shock. "Yes, Colonel," Sarah replied, her tone shifting to the authoritative confidence that had characterized her interactions with subordinate officers throughout her military career. "I've been conducting a classified assessment of this installation's cybersecurity infrastructure. The civilian contractor cover was necessary to avoid drawing attention to security vulnerabilities that might be exploited by adversaries monitoring our activities." Harrison stared at the documents as if they might change if he looked at them long enough. The reality of what had transpired over the past 3 weeks was clearly overwhelming as he processed the implications of his behavior toward a superior officer. "Ma'am," he began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words adequate for the situation. "Colonel Harrison," Sarah said formally, "we have immediate security concerns that require your attention. The intrusion attempts Captain Rodriguez identified represent exactly the type of threat I was sent here to assess. We need to implement comprehensive countermeasures immediately." Harrison attempted to straighten to attention, though his obvious shock and embarrassment made the gesture awkward. "Yes, ma'am. Admiral, I need to apologize for—" "Colonel," Sarah interrupted, "we can address other matters later. Right now, we need to focus on protecting this installation's communication systems and coordinating with appropriate intelligence authorities about these intrusion attempts." The next several hours were a blur of activity as base security personnel implemented emergency cybersecurity protocols under Sarah's direction. Her actual expertise and authority transformed what had been a dismissed civilian assessment into a comprehensive military cybersecurity operation. Captain Rodriguez, who had recognized the legitimacy of her technical findings despite Harrison's dismissive attitude, found himself coordinating directly with a Rear Admiral whose actual experience far exceeded anything he had imagined possible. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said during one of their coordination meetings, "I have to ask, how did you maintain your patience during all those briefings where Colonel Harrison was—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence diplomatically. Sarah smiled slightly. "Captain, in 30 years of military service, I've learned that sometimes the best way to assess a situation is to let people reveal their true character without interference." Lieutenant Morrison, who had spent 3 weeks escorting what he thought was a civilian contractor, approached Sarah with obvious embarrassment about the entire situation. "Admiral," he said formally, "I want to apologize for treating you like—" Again, the sentence trailed off as he struggled to find appropriate words. "Lieutenant," Sarah replied kindly, "you treated me with professionalism and courtesy throughout this assignment. You have nothing to apologize for." Colonel Harrison's position became increasingly uncomfortable as word of the situation spread through the base command structure. The realization that he had spent 3 weeks dismissing, harassing, and undermining a superior officer created immediate complications for his career and his command. When base security successfully countered the intrusion attempts using procedures Sarah had developed, the effectiveness of her actual cybersecurity expertise became undeniable. The same vulnerabilities Harrison had dismissed as civilian overcautiousness proved to be exactly the pathways hostile adversaries had planned to exploit. The investigation into the intrusion attempts revealed sophisticated adversaries with detailed knowledge of military communication protocols, exactly the type of threat Sarah's classified mission had been designed to assess and counter. 3 days after her identity was revealed, Sarah sat in the base commander's office providing a comprehensive briefing on her findings and recommendations. Colonel Harrison was notably absent from the meeting, having been reassigned pending a full investigation of his conduct during her assignment. "Admiral," the base commander said after reviewing her complete assessment, "your work here has potentially prevented a serious compromise of classified communications affecting multiple military commands. The cybersecurity improvements you've recommended will be implemented immediately across all relevant installations." Sarah nodded, satisfied that her mission objectives had been achieved despite the complications created by Harrison's misconceptions and inappropriate behavior. As she prepared to leave the base, Captain Rodriguez approached with obvious respect and gratitude for her patient professionalism throughout the assignment. "Admiral," he said, "I learned more about cybersecurity operations in 3 weeks working with you than in my previous 3 years of technical assignments. Thank you for maintaining your mission focus despite difficult circumstances." Sarah smiled as she packed her laptop bag for the final time. "Captain, remember that effective cybersecurity isn't just about technology. It's about people, procedures, and the wisdom to listen when someone identifies legitimate concerns, regardless of what assumptions you might have about their background." As her flight departed Peterson Air Force Base, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned during her assignment. Military cybersecurity required not just technical expertise, but also the leadership wisdom to recognize threats, regardless of their source, and the professional integrity to prioritize mission success over personal ego. The intrusion attempts had been successfully countered, the base's security infrastructure had been comprehensively upgraded, and military communications across multiple commands were now better protected against sophisticated adversaries. The mission had been accomplished, though not exactly as originally planned. Colonel Harrison's career never recovered from the investigation into his conduct during Sarah's assignment. The combination of his failure to recognize legitimate security threats and his inappropriate treatment of a superior officer created consequences that extended well beyond his command at Peterson Air Force Base. For Sarah, the assignment became another example of the complex challenges facing military cybersecurity operations in an era where threats could come from anywhere and effective protection required combining technical expertise with sound military judgment and professional leadership.